Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government for the next in our joint series with Ernst & Young on women leaders. And thanks very much to Ernst & Young for their support for this series. We've been trying, almost since she was appointed, to get Janice Charette into the UK. It's very unfortunate we managed to get her on the day that all the tubes decided to go on strike. But can I congratulate you for making it through and coming here today. If any of your colleagues wanted to come but couldn't, remember we will, of course, be putting up the video afterwards, and my excellent colleague in the corner is live tweeting. If you want to join in the live tweeting, it's #WomenLeaders, and those are details of how to sign up. So we've built this as a conversation between Melanie Dawes, who many of you will know is Permanent Secretary at the Department of Communities and Local Government. She has also just taken on a new role as the Civil Service Gender Diversity Champion. So Melanie's a very appropriate person to be in a nice conversation, not a sort of Paxman-style inquisition of Janice here today. So what we're going to do is Melanie and Janice are going to talk about issues of common interest for around half an hour. Then there'll be half an hour opportunity for you to put your own questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Melanie Dawes.
Thank you very much, Jill. And can I just say, again, thank you to everybody for getting here through the tube strike. I hope we're going to have a good conversation this morning. More Women's Hour, I hope, than Today programme, more News Night. Janice, I'm just going to start off by, welcoming you and saying thank you for joining us this morning. And just ask a sort of very general question, really. Tell us a little bit about your career to date, how you've got to where you've got to, and what were the big moments along the way.
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks. That's, I think, probably a good way to start. I also want to thank the Institute for Government on putting on this session today, and for the whole series that you're running in this area with the support of friends from Ernst & Young. I think the work that they've been doing in this space is pretty interesting. And for all of you who made it, I saw pictures on the television this morning of what it looked like for some of you to try and get in today, so you're all champions in my mind. I guess I'll tell you a little bit about my career. I probably don't have a traditional Canadian public service career, and maybe that's interesting in and of itself. I did start in our Department of Finance in the Treasury out of university. I was an accidental public servant. I came and joined the public service. I was going to go back and do another degree at university, but the program wasn't quite ready, so I joined. I was going to stay for maybe a year, and that was in 1984. So there you go. I did leave the public service for a time. I went and worked in the private sector. I went and worked at a big consulting firm. I was part of a startup of a Crown corporation. I also worked a little bit in the political realm, but I have spent the vast majority of my career in the public service. And I consider myself to have started really in the policy space. I think my foundation work in the Department of Finance really gave me a really good understanding of kind of the scope of government and how policy is made and how decisions are made. And I think those fundamentals were really important for me and kind of gave me a good base and a good toolkit then as I moved. And I've worked in probably 8 different departments across the federal public service in a variety of different roles. I've worked on many budgets, so I was listening with interest yesterday. I worked on our exercise in program review in the mid-90s, our exercise which was really about Canada conquering the deficit. And after doing that for a couple of years and nobody returning my phone calls after that, that's when I left and went to the private sector. So cutting people's budgets wasn't necessarily the road to win friends and influence people. But it was an important exercise for us and a turning point for the country, actually. I've worked on constitutional matters. I've worked on intergovernmental matters. I've been part of writing speeches from the throne, represented Canada abroad, all of those amazing opportunities. So I think the variety of different departments. I had my most senior roles in ours, the level below deputy minister. So I was an assistant deputy minister both in the Department of Justice, running the policy shop, which was interesting for me. I was a non-lawyer, as they called me, in the Department of Justice. And I'll come back to that actually, because I think that was a interesting formative experience for me in terms of allowing me to take on even more senior roles. I went to our cabinet office in a policy role there, but then I went into our deputy minister stream, and I was a deputy in the cabinet office in our Department of Health, Citizenship and Immigration, Human Resources and Skills Development, kind of work and pensions in your system. And then I became the number 2 in the public service, the deputy clerk, where I served for 4 years, and I was appointed in October to this role. So I don't think there's anything traditional about that. I'd say I never had, people ask me, what was your career plan? I never had a plan. Obviously, if that was a plan, boy, that was a very confused plan. I would say that I went to take on some assignments that other people didn't want to do. I tend to run towards fires as opposed to away from them. Tough challenges and complex problems, oftentimes in a team environment. That's where I found that I worked best. But in a team environment where really it was kind of all hands on deck. So you didn't necessarily have a defined role. You could make a variety of different contributions. And I still to this day am very committed to how do I continue to learn every single day, and I've always approached my jobs in that way. I've also really thought, and it goes back to the Department of Justice for me, and I'll stop. I've always been, tried to be really thoughtful about how when opportunities came knocking, how I evaluated them. And I did learn over time that who I worked for was in some ways even more important than the job that I was asked to do. Because if I was working for someone and with someone who really saw, was empowering, who was interested in my development, who was gonna challenge the heck out of me, give me lots of feedback, but be supportive, that job, even if the content of the job may not necessarily have been something that I had aspired to, that was a really, really fantastic career experience for me, as compared to maybe something which on paper looked like a fantastic job, but maybe not in an environment where I would thrive as well. So you have to figure out for yourself what it is, where it is that you feel that you are the highest performing, what makes you feel the most challenged and fulfilled. And I certainly have no shortage of challenge in my current role. And now my job, I think, is in part to provide that same environment for others.
And when did you first think you might get to the top, to the job you're in now? How did that moment happen for you? And, and what did that feel like?
I never thought I was going to be. I never thought I was going to be an assistant deputy minister. I never thought I was going to be a deputy minister, and I certainly never thought I was going to be the clerk of the Privy Council, the most senior public servant in the country. I always kind of looked up to those people. So to think that I am one of those people, let alone I am the clerk now, still some days I kind of sit behind the desk and I wonder, oh my goodness, someday they're going to come in here and find me,
I have to say, I know that feeling too.
Let her in here. I think it was, I really developed my confidence as I was taking on more senior roles, and I was proving to myself that I could do these things. And I think my own personal mindset was probably the most important determinant of my success. So even, as I was walking in to have my conversation with the Prime Minister around his interest in me taking on this role, I was kind of ambivalent about whether I was the right person to take on the role as the head of our public service at this particular time. And I think that's something that makes me really committed to do the very best job I can do every single day.
I don't know if you've ever had that feeling of thinking, well, if it isn't me, then it's going to be one of these other people, and maybe actually I can do it after all. There's something about where you are amongst your colleagues. I want to turn on to the question of women, women leading in public service. You actually did pretty well on this in Canada compared to the UK. We're not doing too badly. We've got nearly 40% of the senior civil service are women. 1 in 3 of the main 18 departments is headed by a woman. But we still have a lot to work on, and we'd like to get those numbers up a bit as well. how have you done so well in Canada? Because your numbers are better still than ours, and we've never had a female head of the whole civil service.
And I'm the second
head
of the civil service in Canada, second female. So I went back and getting ready for this, actually looked at some of our numbers. So in the public service in Canada, about, let me just see now, I'm trying to find the number, about 55% of the public service, the core public service, is female. So 55%, that's a good starting point, I would say. Our ratio of female participation in the executive ranks of the public service is 46%. That's a good number. And that's up from 1983, where we were at 5%. So I started in 84, which is why that's the number I could find. So when I started, 5%, and now up to 46%. And I think that, so that's a process that I think has been an important progression over time. In the deputy minister ranks, 41% of our deputy ministers, either the folks who run the departments or the number twos in those departments, 41% of those folks are female. So there's a lot of role models around. I think that's important. But you have to take a step back, I think, and look at the broader Canadian context. Labour force participation rates in Canada are amongst the highest in the OECD. There's lots of reasons for that. We have a very diverse population, so I think we look at diversity really as a strength and an asset in the country. And I think the business case in the public sector is slightly different than how you would look at the business case or the value proposition in the private sector. But when you're thinking about the delivery of programs and services, the development of policy for a very diverse population, I think you can only do that well if you are representative of the population you're trying to serve. And then you have to figure out, once you get past representation, which is way more than just numbers, it really is how do you draw on all of that, the strength of that diversity, whether it's experience, whether it's a regional background, professional background, where you come from, your family structure, whatever it is that goes into diversity, those are strengths. And so I think that feeds into the creativity and your ability to understand and serve well the population that you're there to serve. So we have a good track record. We've had very successful females across some really important roles in the public sector. Right now, 3 of the 9 Supreme Court judges in Canada are female, including the Chief Justice. We've had female governors general in Canada, and we actually even briefly had a prime minister who was female, briefly, unfortunately. But I don't think then that it's such a surprise to see females in senior leadership roles. And I think that's not necessarily the case. I wouldn't have said that when I started in 1983. But as I worked my way through my career, I have to say I never thought of myself as, okay, I'm doing this as a woman professional in the public service. I really thought of myself as a professional public servant. And so I would look at competing for a challenge or making my way into a consideration for some opportunity, really on the basis of merit and being the best person for the job. But I realize now, as I look back in that progression from 1983, where there was only 5% female executives, that there was a lot of people that came ahead of me that were really trailblazers. For them, their experience may have been a lot tougher than it was for me. And so I have to give a lot of credit to the women who took on those leadership roles when it was probably a lot tougher for them. And my success, and I didn't have to worry about what was different about being a female because a lot of them had really kind of blazed the trail for me.
It does sound like you are a sort of a step ahead in Canada in terms of the trailblazing. But have you ever experienced yourself, though, as a woman, that you were approaching decisions about your career or about how to approach a job in a different way from your male colleagues? Have you ever felt, that as a woman you were bringing something slightly different? I mean, sometimes it can be harder for women, I think, to push themselves forward for jobs. Have you ever Have you ever felt that yourself, or do you think that's a factor?
I think everybody has to weigh different things as they're looking at their careers. I think increasingly things like family responsibilities are something that men take into consideration in the same way that women take into consideration. I myself am a mother of 2 children, and so I had to think about those things as I was looking at career opportunities. In our family arrangement, my husband has been hugely supportive and was a stay-at-home dad with our kids, which freed me up then to take on some roles. But I had to make choices around those kinds of things. I had to. I never looked at thinking, right, that's not a kind of a job that a woman can do. I never thought about it that way, but I think it's. But I suspect that there are some areas and some folks where that would be a consideration, but it never really kind of entered into my mind.
Okay. My own daughter has her last day at primary school today,
Oh.
so it's a moment of transition for our family.
But you'll be a great role model for her.
Well,
role models are hugely important.
Yeah,
I'm
not sure she'd put it that way, but hopefully in some
Someday
in some
she will.
respects,
She'll never
in some
admit it to
respects.
you,
No,
but I suspect she'll
exactly,
think it. So there
exactly.
you go.
Let's turn to the question of the civil service in Canada and your overall leadership challenge.
Great.
How is that for you? You're a few months into the job. What are the big things you want to achieve?
It's interesting, actually. One of my objectives of coming to visit the UK was actually to have a conversation with Sir Jeremy Haywood and others in senior leadership positions in the UK public service, because the UK civil service reform agenda has a lot of similarities with some of the priorities that we have in Canada. My predecessor, Wayne Waters, launched a public service-wide engagement process around a vision for the public service of what we want to be in 2020. It's called Blueprint 2020. And so we had almost a year-long engagement process in terms of what are the broad themes and priorities, and then how are we going to get there. Over 110,000 public servants participated in some way, shape, or form in this engagement exercise. We validated a set of priorities and choices for ourselves, broad strategic themes. And now we're in the process of actually making that happen. And I think some of the objectives that we've talked about in Canada will resonate very much with some of the thematics you'll be familiar with here. How do we build an open, networked public service, which puts an emphasis on how we collaborate both within the public service in terms of solving problems and achieving results for the citizens that we serve, as well as being more open and consultative and engaging with others who are other partners who can collaborate with us to achieve those kinds of results. How do we make best use of the talent that we have within the public service to be able to develop, to identify, recruit, retain, develop folks to have the skills and competencies that we're going to need for the challenges not that we face today, but that we're going to face in the future. How do we make sure that people have kind of modern tools and have access to the techniques that are going to allow them to serve Canadians in different ways? So Canadians, like citizens around the world, can interact with their banks, interact with retail companies on their mobile devices, and you're not able to do that in the same kind of way yet with government. Well, we need to be able to respond to that in terms of how we deliver services, because citizens are judging our performance and our competency in a relative sense in terms of their comparison with the private sector experience. So I think there's a shared set of challenges there. We have to learn to be more nimble, more agile. The speed of change and the overwhelming scope of the changes which governments are facing, which private sectors are facing, which charitable organizations and citizen groups are facing. Governments have to be operating at that same speed. And our cycle times, the pace of our operations, isn't necessarily aligned with the pace at which issues are coming up and are having to be resolved. So how can we be more nimble? How can we be more agile? So that's a big remit, and so we are going to take this on And we're doing this through a variety of initiatives, some of which are happening across the public service enterprise-wide initiatives, building ourselves kind of a modern, efficient, high-quality, client service-oriented back office, but which is standardized and consolidated across the public service. So for functions like human resources and finance and IT, that back office will be very consistent, standardized, and consolidated across all of our departments. So a backbone and infrastructure we can all work from. And those kinds of things are underway. Departments and agencies have to think about what does it mean to be excellent and high performing. So in your organization, what it means to be excellent and high performing can be quite different than what that means in Treasury or what that means in Work and Pensions or the Home Office. Same in our organizations. So what does it mean to be excellent in the organization that you're working in, and what's your agenda to get there? We're using functional communities and groups like our executives, our managers, our young professionals, groups of financial managers, communications professionals, visible minorities, women's groups, to what does it mean for them to actually move towards this vision of the future of the public service. In my recent report to the Prime Minister on the state of the public service, that is an annual expectation of the Clerk of the Privy Council as head of the public service, do an annual report. I've identified 3 priorities for us for this year. The first is recruitment. Our attrition and retirement numbers are at least 3 times more than we're recruiting right now into the public service. And so this is not a growth model for the public service. We're not in a position to be growing the public service, but we have to be thinking, I think, very strategically about how are we recruiting, making sure that we're recruiting the skills and competencies and the talent from that diverse talent pool that's going to allow us to serve into the future, and developing our current public servants to be able to have the skills and competencies needed for the future, to be able to manage in a partnership model, which could be different than doing it all ourselves. Secondly, I put a real focus on healthy, respectful workplaces, and making sure that that's, I think, a pretty key part of a high-performing workforce, that individuals feel that that's the environment that they're working in, with a particular focus around mental health. We, like all large organizations, I think, are facing increasing rates of mental health challenges, both our employees or their families. And I think we need to create an environment where people feel comfortable to raise those issues and be supported in those issues the same way as if they broke their leg or they had some other kind of physical ailment. And I think we have a long way to go on building stigma-free workplaces. And finally, my last priority is actually, I think, will resonate very directly because we kind of stole it a little bit from some work that was being done here in the UK, and that is putting a focus on policy making as a profession. Yeah. And I think for policymakers, this new world that we're operating in, where I talked about an open, networked, collaborative public service, to be able to do that as a policymaker, to be able to out there and engaging, using new tools and techniques to make sure that we're connecting policy to operations, implementation, and delivery. Those are new challenges for policymakers. So how do we make sure that they have the skills to be able to do that? So that's our agenda for this year, and we are rolling that out a variety of different ways, using obviously part of the commitments for senior leaders across the public service to make progress on those things. Our employees are part of this as well, though. So my report really concludes with a challenge to every individual public servant. What can you do in your own organization to try and make this the best place to work and deliver the optimal results for the country? Because we're engaged in, I think, among the most interesting jobs. Your chance to influence the future of policy, the chance to make a difference for your country. I mean, there's no better job. Right? So what can you do to try and make a difference? I think that I get a great response from that, I think.
A lot of that resonates with us.
Oh,
I think
good.
that need to invest not just in the new skills like commercial, digital, finance management and so on that we may not have invested in enough in the past, but also to invest in the ones that are our core business of policy making.
Absolutely.
Is incredibly important and actually very positive. And inspiring for our people.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I hope so. I think it is a broad call to action and reinforces, I think, some really important functions that the public service has played in the past and will continue to play in the future, maybe in different ways. Maybe in different ways, but that shouldn't be threatening. I think that should be, really about new opportunities and new directions.
I think this is a good moment to think about opening it up to the floor for questions. I'm going to ask, so get your questions ready, but I'm going to ask you one more before we do that, Janice, which is a lot of what you've just described adds up to culture change.
Right.
How do you view that phrase? Some people, I have to say, I'm never quite sure whether I think it's a positive way to lead, or in some sense goes too much to personal values and can put people on the defensive a little bit. And you didn't actually use it as a core part of what you were saying, but it is in the end a lot of what we want to achieve as leaders is a change in the way organisations feel to work in. How do you view that, and how do you think we do achieve those changes in a way that engages?
Yeah, I think I don't think you can set out to change culture per se. I think you can set out to change what you do and how you do it, but you can. I think leadership has an important role to play in terms of the tone that's set from the top of how an organization is going to function. But it's got to be backed up by actions. And so I've really put a focus, I think all of our senior leadership team has put really a focus on what it is we're doing, which is about changing both what we do and how we do it. And that's actually, I think, going to be the definitive test for individuals about whether things are really changing, rather than kind of try to have a statement of culture or just kind of operate at that level. I think it's almost too ambiguous for people, and they can really more focus on, well, what's actually changing in my job, in what I do and how I do it every single day, and the kind of office I'm coming into and the colleagues that I'm working with. That's what actually feels concrete and different for me, and I think that actually is culture. Now, I think one thing I should say that I think sometimes we talk so much about change that I think it's also important, like there's some things that are foundational in the public service that aren't going to change. And I think that's probably an area where we have a shared set of values. The integrity of the public service is so critical to the trust that citizens have in us. Our ability to be a non-partisan, professional public service with a high state of commitment to values, the stewardship of public resources. Those things are not going to change. Those are our touchstone in an environment where everything else is changing. And I do think that is part of the culture we want to make sure that we are preserving as we move forward.
Great. Okay, so it's your time to ask any questions that you'd like to. So can I look around the room and see, yes, a gentleman just there.
Roger Goss from the campaigning group Patient Concern. Positive discrimination, good or bad, desirable or undesirable? To what extent do women's looks and dress sense remain significant in their success?
Janice,
well, those are nice, easy questions, eh? I think I should have had another cup of tea this morning.
Yeah.
Positive discrimination. We've gotten to a state in Canada where I believe we have critical mass of female participation, and now we're in the business of sustaining that. How we got there, though, I think, as I look back and I see the progress that was made, my concern about the idea of positive discrimination is that somehow it sounds like merit is not at the heart of it. And I think if you're promoting individuals who aren't capable of doing the job, who don't meet those essential merit criteria, then I think ultimately you're not going to have sustainable progress. So I think that's got to be the starting point for you. Look and dress. I think that's a human reality, but I don't think it's limited to women.
No.
I think how anybody looks and dresses in a professional setting is a determinant of how they're perceived by other individuals. Yeah, I think there's probably still, I worked for a woman prime minister for a while, and I was astonished to read comments about, what outfit she was wearing and how her hair looked that day, and I've never seen that about a male prime minister. So I think that is a reality in some ways. I don't hear that in the senior ranks of the public service in Canada, but I think there's a certain standard that all of us have to maintain. And then I think it comes down to actually, can you do the job? Are you willing to take on the tough assignments that give you the skill sets necessary to be able to operate at even more senior levels?
Can I just say on the question of positive discrimination, I think merit has to come first, and we're very clear about that in the civil service. But I think things like making sure that you have a gender mix on panels, making sure that you go out and look for as balanced a field as you possibly can. Sometimes those are habits that are new, and it can feel like you're doing something quite radical, and people can feel sometimes quite uncomfortable about that, and it can feel like some people might even describe it as a form of discrimination, where actually what you're doing is just making the effort that you should have made before. So I think a lot of those things require quite a lot of effort and push in the system, but to actually go so far as to as not to appoint in the end on merit is certainly a step we haven't taken in the UK civil service.
There's also little things you can do. I think actually the equivalent of league tables. So you look department by department and compare performance. So, okay, so how are you doing in the department of X, Y, or Z? What is your percentage of senior executives who are female? I think that our Prime Minister, in our cabinet settings, we've got now a scorecard for every minister for appointments coming forward in terms of how they've been doing on female representation in appointments. And he makes a point of asking about that at every cabinet meeting. So you're looking at, see where you rank, number one to the bottom of the pile. And it's amazing, actually, the effect that has when you draw attention to that every single month and you're in a leadership position. You haven't got a quota, you haven't got to comply or explain, but that kind of transparency, I think, has an effect.
Okay, lots of questions coming through. The lady in the white shirt, yeah.
Hi, thanks. Jane Dudman from The Guardian, from our Public Leaders Network. I was very interested in what you were saying about making mental health a priority for your workforce, and I wondered actually if I could make it a question for both of you, because particularly in the UK, we're seeing a lot of stress among the public sector workers that we talk to on a regular basis. And I wondered, first of all, how you can, what the concrete moves are that you're going to do, and how you might address that also in the UK. So a question to both of you.
That's a good question. I'm going to take a couple and then just that.
Thanks. Harriet Thompson from Department for Energy and Climate Change. You mentioned just now a focus from the top about how departments were doing in relation to each other as to women representation. Could you talk about any other things that Canada has done over the years to progress from that 5% up to where it is now? Just to think about whether there's anything we could learn from here.
Okay. Janice, do you want to say something about mental health, and then I'll come in on that question as
I'm
well.
happy to do that. One of the concrete things we're doing actually is there's an organization in Canada, the Mental Health Commission, which has done some work on basically a standard for occupational health and safety, which is really focused on mental health in the workplace. And we're together with our bargaining agents. We have a task force looking at whether and how that standard could be applied in the federal public service. I think it's important actually, that idea actually came from our bargaining agents, came from our union colleagues as part of the collective bargaining process. And we've decided that it was so important that actually we would kind of move it on a faster track than through the collective bargaining process, and actually try and have a task team looking at this and see what we can do within our organizations. I will be continuing to look at other initiatives that we can take in this space. I actually think, though, that just saying for somebody in the senior role, in the role of the head of the civil service to say that it is important within our organizations that we are able to talk about these things, that we are actually organizing learning activities. We had a very good session for our for deputy ministers around, okay, so what does good mental health look like in your workplace? How can you recognize where there are signs of stress and strain in your workforce, and what can you actually do, and equipping frontline managers with the tools to be able to deal with this. I think there's a lot we can do on the learning and development side, and we've started that process. In terms of other things that we've done in Canada around the gender, in terms of trying to make that progress on gender, as I said, I think that once we got to critical mass, some of the tools that you would think of as part of your regular toolkit for good human resource planning, identifying, having structured talent management processes to identify up-and-coming individuals, to have good succession planning processes, to make sure that you have rigorous performance management conversations with learning plans for individuals, which are geared to, for those individuals who have potential, helping them continue to stretch and continue to grow. That'll allow you to sustain the progress. The support for informal mentoring and networking, I think, is important. We've also, I think, it's interesting looking in this room today, I think this started out as a conversation of women about women. And I don't think that's a particularly successful model. It has to be actually seen as core business, so it has to be, I think, everyone identifying that this is a priority for us. Some of the things that you mentioned in terms of diversity in the selection panels, making sure you have tools which avoid any bias in the selection process, which allow for different approaches to be recognized and supported in the interview process and the selection process, I think are also pretty critical.
So let me say something about those questions. And on mental health, I think it's a really good point. I mean, mental health is going up the agenda as a policy issue, clearly, certainly from where I sit in communities and local government. A lot of the agenda around integrating services locally is about recognising that unless you put the mental health issues alongside support for work, for example, you're just not going to actually achieve results that really are sustainable. So it's incredibly important, and something I think we, in every field we're doing more on. And as leaders of organisations, we are beginning to open up these conversations in the civil service. When I was at HMRC some years back, I was disability champion and began a conversation with our staff about mental health and was really quite overwhelmed by how much people wanted to talk about it. A lot of this comes down, I believe, to good, sympathetic, focused management. It's about recognising diversity in teams. It's about managers getting under the skin of how people are behaving and why. Sometimes it's like many areas of diversity, quite small changes to how you behave. And I think we've learnt this on gender over the years. Small differences in work patterns and adjustments for women with small children can make all the difference as to whether staying in a job is sustainable. And I think a lot of those same principles apply when you're thinking about mental health and other forms of sort of health-related or disability-related issues. So I don't have an answer which is kind of there's a big agenda here in the civil service. I think there are a lot of things we're doing, and I think we need to do more. And if I can just say on gender, what we're doing in the UK in the civil service. I inherited my role just a couple of months ago from Sharon White. And we've got some really good work going on in a few strands at the moment. One of them has been data. We've now got and have sent to all departments as of about 3-4 months ago, packs with really quite comprehensive data from the numbers at the top right through to all our kind of pipelines and success rates in jobs and so on, so that we can start to get more transparent about this. We've given our networks in departments that information so they can use it to challenge their boards and get the dialogue going up and down the organisation. We've doing some work on maternity. There's a new pack gone out to help people sort of understand what's the best offer that we should be offering rather than letting it be a lowest common denominator. We're doing some work on job sharing and part-time. We're pretty good on job shares, actually. I think this is an area where we lead in the UK in the civil service. But part-time, slightly less easy to find jobs 3 days a week sometimes. A bit more imagination often can get you further. But we're opening up some new areas and beginning to engage men, actually, in what they want out of gender diversity, and that's proving to be really interesting. And funnily enough, mental health is one of the issues that's come out of that. So, you know, for me, this is very much a broadening area. I don't think there are single solutions to ultimately changing culture, changing quite fundamental decision-making. And there's huge support for this from Jeremy Haywood and the other perm sex. It's not just a small handful of us by any means. So, more questions. Yeah, the lady at the back wanted to speak earlier.
Morning, Rachel McGrewer from the Department for Work and Pensions. I've recently been involved in setting up a women's network within our department, and one of the themes that's come up is geography and location for career progression. So we have a dominance of London within this country, and obviously Canada has a very dispersed population. How has that played into the diversity within your civil service and making sure that people can have careers in lots of different parts of the country?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Another one? Yeah, just there.
Excuse me, Daniel Thornton here at the Institute. You mentioned that the public service in Canada needed to become more agile, and the Prime Minister here has said the same, as has the Cabinet Office Minister recently at an event here. What does this involve in practice in terms of public service processes?
Janice.
Okay, diversity in geography. About 58% of the federal public service employment is outside of the National Capital Region in Canada. So that's the Ottawa-Gatineau area. I would say that we face similar challenges which are not limited to diversity, which are more general, of individuals working in the regions feeling like they have enough opportunities to get a diversity of experience to allow them to take on senior roles. And we don't necessarily have the same variety and number of senior roles available in our regions. We have had in the past probably a little bit better tradition of making sure that individuals who take on the most senior roles, which tend to be almost all, but not exclusively in Ottawa, have experience in working either in the regions or in organizations with regional responsibilities. We've moved a little bit away from that, and I think that that's probably something that we're looking at as part of our talent management processes now. Is that an area where we need to kind of revisit what our practices are? We have an additional challenge of the importance of second language capacity. So all executives in the senior ranks of the public service in Canada doit être capable de fonctionner dans les deux langues, travailler dans les deux langues, la langue de Molière ainsi que l'anglais. So that also can be a particular challenge for those parts of the country which don't necessarily have as much access to French as a second language as part of the everyday life. We can provide all of the learning supports, but if you spend a lot of time in a classroom and then you go back out into an all English operating environment, it can be just a little bit more challenging to both develop and then retain that second language skill. So I think I don't think that that's a UK limited problem. I think it is how do you make sure that you've got good career progression in the regions and good understanding of regional in headquarters functions is a shared challenge for all of us. Agility. So I think that that's a very good question about how do you measure actually.
What is it?
What is it? I think we know what it looks like when we're not being agile. In the Canadian system, the time frame that's necessary to actually pass a regulation can be double-digit months. From the conception through all of the analytical stage, a consultation and engagement, the refinement of the regulation, and the the promulgation of regulation. Then you actually have to implement and move into compliance and enforcement activities, like 15, 18 months to get to actually the new regulation. That's a long time in a world where things are moving so much more quickly. So what can we do to look at the cycle times of individual activities? But also, I think that there's a lot of reasons why public sector organizations who are committed to preserving and protecting the public interest don't necessarily move on a dime. It's more like turning the Queen Mary, I think. And so I think there's a lot of merit to that, but there may be areas where some of our organizational structures and our processes are, they may have more steps just for the sake of process as opposed to actually generating value and results. And I think we have to look at whether or not that's gumming up the works and actually getting in the way of actually generating results. When we did our blueprint consultation exercise, we heard a lot about that from employees, which is, boy, there's a lot of rules, there's a lot of process, and we're not actually sure at the end of the day what that's doing to help to generate results for taxpayers or improve the quality of life of the citizens we're trying to serve. So maybe we need to look at internal red tape in the same way that governments look at red tape in serving small business, for example. That has I think that can have a pretty disempowering effect on the workforce as well. So that's one of the things that one of the initiatives underway is actually look at that internal red tape. And we have a tiger team trying to go around to different departments and kind of say, right, what's this rule? What are the rules that actually you think, or the reports that are generated that you're not sure anybody ever uses, that are not actually adding value, and what can we do about actually getting rid of those things? So I think it takes a variety of different forms.
Yeah. And I just say, I think that at its best, the civil service is extraordinarily fleet of foot, having just led a department through an election campaign which was uncertain in its outcome until the very last minute, through to introducing, getting a bill through committee stage already, I think, in the last few days. More legislation going in today with a brand new ministerial team. Some of the effort that my colleagues has put in has been quite extraordinary, but we're not always fast at everything.
Can I say one thing, Melanie?
Yeah.
I think Melanie's point's a really good one. It reminds me that, when we have crises, I think the Canadian Public Service is extraordinary, right? We can do amazing things in response to unexpected events. It's just a peacetime that sometimes we revert back to activities where we don't necessarily show that same capacity.
And the election was peacetime, of course.
Of course.
There's a question here, and then the lady just there in the middle. So, yeah, you've been asking for a while.
Thank you. This is fascinating for me. I'm writing a piece at the moment on women in Whitehall over the last 40 years. So to hear the comparison from Canada is really very interesting. One of the things that has come out in our report, though, and we've not really touched upon it yet, is the role of ministers. And a lot of our interviewees talked about how that can have both a negative and a very positive effect. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that. Particularly, and Melanie's just touched on it, you've got your own election coming up, and as I understand it, the polls are quite close, possibility of coalition government, so I thought Melanie might have a few tips for you.
Let's take a couple more. We'll try and get as many as possible. Yes, the lady just there in the middle.
Hi, I'm Nicole at the Institute for Government. I should say, disclaimer, I'm Canadian, so I am... I'm just wondering how much you see your role as being about public engagement, because it's because of the nature of the way the government is divided in Canada, it's quite difficult to reach out to the Canadian public from the federal government level. So I'm just wondering, how much you think public engagement is part of your role. Should it be, shouldn't it be?
And then just here.
Executive on the board of the Department of Health. Could you say something about the time when you stepped out into the private sector? How did it feel to be a senior woman manager there, and any reflections that you brought back to your role in the public sector? Thank you.
Janice,
three very different questions,
yeah.
Exactly. The role of ministers. So I would say, Mel and I had a bit of a conversation before we started. I think the process by which our senior executives, and in our case, deputy ministers, perm secs, are selected is slightly different in Canada than it is in the UK. And so ministers don't necessarily have a voice or a vote in that selection process. That the nomination of deputy ministers is done by me, and we don't have a selection process that leads to that. We have very rigorous selection processes up to the assistant deputy minister level, but the promotion into the deputy minister ranks is done through a talent management process, which ultimately I have a committee of senior officials that advises me on, but I ultimately make the recommendation, and then the Prime Minister makes that choice. So then the question is, do ministers have an impact in terms of the success of how you work? But it doesn't necessarily affect the selection process. And I actually think that it hasn't been. I haven't noticed anything either positively or negatively in terms of the role of ministers. 25% of the current crop of cabinet ministers is female, and they work with a variety of different organizational arrangements, and I don't think it really has had an impact in the Canadian context. Public engagement. To go to your question, we had a very interesting meeting yesterday afternoon with Chris Wormold, and in his role as head of the policy profession, and heard about open policy making and all of the work that's going on in the UK. I think that is, as we look at policy as a profession in Canada, how do we change our default setting to open policy making is something that I've been talking about and thinking about with our colleagues in Canada who are involved in that policy profession. I think if the public service ever had a monopoly on advice to ministers, that has long since evaporated. And I think that's probably a good thing. There are lots of informed think tanks, including some of you here in the room today, academics, practitioners, public sector, private sector, in our case in Canada, other levels of government, provinces, territories, municipalities, international players. It's a crowded public policy space. And so how do we in the public service basically access the best of that, and in some ways kind of take the best of it, synthesize it, and help ministers to make their way through and really figure out kind of what's the important part of all of that information, and how do they take those pieces together to actually inform their decision-making process. It doesn't take away the importance of public service advice, but I think what it means is 5 smart people, public servants in some room somewhere, shouldn't be thinking that they have neither the opportunity nor the obligation to kind of think about what all the right answers are. I think it can be a very much more open process. But we have, I think all of our challenges in terms of how best to go about doing that. My experience in the private sector, I have to say every bit of my experience about being in the private sector was so very different of what my experience was in the public sector, starting from the day I walked in and was given my laptop, which of course I still never had in the public sector. That was a few years ago. And I operated very much in a plug and play environment. I was in a consulting firm, so my job was to be out there working in client offices. And so I didn't really have an office, let alone, I was out in the field. I had to account for my time in a very different way. So I learned, in the public service, I would call, I was working on a particularly thorny issue. I'd call 5 of my colleagues together and try and kind of talk it through. And so I did that in my first consulting assignment. Then they all added their time to my billing. Well, what happened there? Well, yeah, that's the way it works. Right? Okay, lesson learned. We talked about culture earlier. I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was that was different in the culture, but I knew I was working in a very different kind of organization. It was a fantastic experience. I learned a tremendous amount, but I also learned that actually I love working in the public sector. I love the complexity of the issues that I was working on. I love my work in the private sector and the clients that I was serving and the work that I was doing, but I didn't want to be advising about it. I wanted to be doing it. And so, not a surprise, I came back.
Okay, I think just one more round of questions. Yes, just one there, and then Peter. I'll allow you to ask the last one.
Hi, Nadine Smith from the Boston Consulting Group. Yesterday, the World Economic Forum put out 10 questions you should ask every leader in interviews to test their EQ.
Yes, I read that.
And I just wondered whether or not, talking about the importance of recruitment and getting the right people in, how do you, in both Canada and the UK, test those skills, those soft skills, social skills, empathy skills at the recruitment stage, and again, partway through career and before getting up to the top of the civil service?
Good question.
Yeah, Peter Riddle, the Director of the Institute of Government. Janice, thanks very much for coming here. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. I just wanted to ask a question following on one or two of the other ones. Canada being a federal structure, the public service in Canada you've been talking about, all right, it's spread over Canada, but it's very much of the national government. Here we still have at least in theory, a unified civil service. So the civil service of the Welsh government and the Scottish government are part of the civil service nationally, Northern Ireland being slightly separate. And the defence of that is on values and approaches, to promotion and spreading best practice on many of the things Melanie's been talking about earlier. So I wondered how you related to some of the provincial civil services, and particularly the former leader of British Columbia sitting in front of you. I just wondered how that worked, because the relationship between the national and provincial.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good. Why don't you
Good. How do we test, how do we look at the soft skills as part of recruitment? I think that increasingly in our experience, and I think it's ever more important as you progress to more senior levels in our public service, what you do is important, but how you do it is taking more and more weight. And so that's reinforced both in terms of how we assess people at the selection process. Probably at entry level, what we're really looking at is your ability to work in teams, to be collaborative. That's tested largely through interviews as opposed to through testing or things like that. As we get to more senior levels, we have used a psychometric assessment, which I gather is part of your toolkit as well, to look at some of the softer skills. We've also built it in not just at the recruitment stage, not just at the development stage, but in performance management as well, so that we are very much instructing people that as part of what our expectations are, here's your deliverables for the year, but here's the way that we expect people to behave, and we're assessing folks on both sides of that and giving feedback on both. We have a set of key leadership competencies of what we expect for individuals as they get into the management, supervisory, and above level, and it's very clear from those key leadership competencies, they're all about the soft skills, the how, as opposed to your hard knowledge or hard kind of technical expertise and credentials. So I think that's all of a piece and all mutually reinforcing. I had a conversation with some of your counterparts over the last couple of days, and I think we kind of agreed that for the most senior positions, and I think this comes to the importance of role modeling, being smart is really not enough to be successful in the most senior areas. It really is so much about how you interact with individuals, how you attract and retain teams, how you manage people, how you manage relationships. That's a true determinant of success, and I think we've learned that, how important that is. Peter, your question in terms of the Canadian experience and the interaction between federal and provincial public services. We had a bit of this conversation yesterday, the High Commissioner and I. The civil services are quite different. So the federal public service, I think it's more of a collaboration and exchange of best practices is the way I would say that we work together. I have continued a practice that was set up by one of my predecessors of meeting semi-annually with my counterparts in the provinces and territories, the clerks and cabinet secretaries from the other 13 governments. And we meet virtually once a year and in person once a year, and as leaders of the public service to actually have conversations about those things that really only the leadership of the public service is focused on. our shared agenda around management of the public service. And we compare notes around things like performance management. We compare notes around issues of how we are recruiting individuals, of what our challenges are in terms of our reform agendas, the reform of compensation, pay and benefits, and comparing notes around those things. I think that one of the areas which, as the federal public service, I'm interested in looking at is we have tended to have what I would describe as a career employment model, which is why my kind of in and out experience is maybe a little less traditional. People join and they spend more or less their career in the public service. And I think we need to look at kind of a diversity of models so that individuals can come, stay for a couple of years, go out, get different experiences, learn about the private sector, learn about the not-for-profit sector, perhaps have an international experience as well, and then be able to come back in. So that in and out, the more permeable, would include also the opportunity to go and work in a provincial government or having provincial government officials coming working in a federal experience. We have that, but it's more kind of up to the individual as opposed to thinking about that as kind of a structured program. I think maybe that's something that we need to look a bit more at. I think the experience, certainly given the division of powers and the responsibilities of provinces and territories in Canada, they deliver really important programs and services, health, education. Those are experiences we don't necessarily have in the federal public service. Would be very valuable, and I think that we do things that provinces don't necessarily do, and equally there could be really good knowledge transfer and experience built if we did that maybe in a bit more structured way.
So let me just say a few things about EQ, and then I'll wrap us up. So because I think it brings us on in the end to leadership, which is what the theme of today's discussion is about. When I joined the Treasury back in the early 1990s, in fact I joined the Civil Service more than 26 years ago, there was no focus on management and leadership assessment to get promoted, but that did come in the mid-1990s. And since then I think we've grown massively in our understanding of the importance of what one might broadly call EQ, but in the end is all about what makes an effective leader. These days it's almost impossible to get to a DG or PermSec appointment without a staff panel being part of the process of assessment. I went through that for my own appointment. One of the members of the staff panel is sitting in this room. You know, it's amazing how if you simply ask a group of staff in a department how somebody comes across, you get insight that's really clear and really, really good. So I think we're taking this increasingly seriously. In the end, the other thing that is incredibly important is psychometrics that you do for yourself as part of your development. The important part of EQ is knowing yourself, knowing your own motivations, your strengths, your weaknesses, and how they change and differ in different circumstances. And no leader is effective really unless they manage themselves as well as managing the organisations that they're leading. But on that note, I just want to thank you, Janice, for coming and talking to us this morning, sharing your experiences and inspiring us by what you've achieved and are planning to continue to achieve in Canada. Been delighted to have that conversation with you this morning. So, thank you.
To you, Melanie, and your particularly as a new PermSec and important female role model, and also in your role as champion for diversity in the UK civil service. Important jobs, and it sounds like you have a lot of support in this room for the work that and the challenges you have, and you need to support her.
You're right.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the conversation. Thank you.